Sunday, Sunday, Sunday. June 27th, join us for EduPodLoza.
There will be over a dozen edupodcasters.
Listen for some rhythm and rhyme.
That's a poetry slam, boys and girls.
Roundtable discussion.
Just some teachers talking about teaching and laughing and having a good time.
Role-playing games.
Oh, yeah, for you nerds out there, you know you're gonna like that stuff.
Radio drama.
Dum 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 dum. Ah!
And really funny people.
At least really funny looking, if nothing else. 1 to 9 on June 27th, Eastern Standard Time. We will be live streaming. There'll be links. We'll put it on the Twitter. We'll make sure that you know where it is. Follow us at Unprocast if you're not already, because that's probably going to be the easiest way to know when it's going live.
June 27th. Free up your calendar now.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an urban educator for more than 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, an educational consultant, an equity advocate, and the co-host of Inside the Principal's Office. Let's get started. Before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to tell you about a super exciting event that I have coming up, and I would love for you to be in attendance. As I mentioned in the intro to the show, I am the co-host of Inside the Principal's Office, a web series that runs live on the first and third Saturday of each month. During the show, my co-host Michael McWilliams and I bring on other educational leaders and discuss the most pressing issues and topics facing us today. We also have a Facebook group where educators can connect and learn from each other. Well, this summer, we're planning to host an event where we can get together in person. That's right, not another Zoom or a Google Meet, but live. Even better, it's only $35. So join us in Dallas for a networking reception on Friday, July 30th, followed by a day of activities on Saturday, July 31st. Stop by our Twitter page, join us on Facebook, or check out an upcoming episode for more information. I look forward to finally meeting you. This episode is a pause to ponder segment. These bi-weekly sessions will allow me to share with you my personal thoughts and reflections on a wide spectrum of topics as they relate to education. It is my hope that you will be able to take something from these segments and apply it in a meaningful way as you continue to do amazing work. Remember, while we all have different roles, we all have a single job: educating our students. Have you heard of the Overthrowing Education podcast? No. This isn't an advertisement. I only ask because Batsheva, the host, and I just had a conversation for an episode that will be released this fall. However, since we're talking about it, I would highly recommend that you pop over after this episode and give it a shot. If nothing else, I know you'll love the fomercials. Anyway, during our discussion, we talked for a moment about curriculum, and it's been on my mind ever since. Hence, this episode. You see, when I first started teaching, I had nothing. No textbook, no curriculum, no framework, nothing. I was pointed to the standards and told those are the goals, get them there, and then I was left essentially alone. Initially, I felt lost, confused, frustrated even. I expected to be able to walk around with that holy grail of knowledge. You know, that educator guidebook that provided all of the information and answers to student questions. To me, that was the key to a successful teacher. After all, how else would they know what to teach, when to teach it, and if students were learning? To me, this was all a process that was carefully curated by that thick text meticulously guarded by teachers. During the first few years of my educational journey, I was required to develop my own curriculum using a variety of resources. Each year it changed to reflect my deepening understanding of the standards, and each year it changed to match the interests and needs of my students. Each year was different, and yet it was the same. Our goals didn't change much, but the routes we took to reach them seemed to consistently change each year. And you know what? It worked. Despite facing the major obstacle of language acquisition, my EL students never failed to meet AYP. They were successful. They were successful year after year, despite not having a textbook crafted by some large publishing company. And it was this point that I wanted to explore a little more closely with you in this episode. You see, as I reflect on those difficult early years, I came to realize that while challenging, they were also formidable. They instilled within me an approach that I would take with me into other classrooms, other schools, and other positions, despite having that which I initially coveted. To me, that classroom set of texts simply became another resource. In fact, I was often chided for making so many copies. This was before the technological access we have now, when there were materials in the room. The truth was that those textbooks rarely contained the information my class needed to reach their goals. If my job was to help them master the standards, then we would need to carve our own path. And that we did. So here are a few lessons that I learned through this process. The first one. A teacher should not need to rely on a master addition to provide them with the answers to the content that they are teaching. I vividly remember teachers calling on students, students providing answers, teachers checking that book, and then letting the student know whether or not the answer was correct. Why would a teacher need to consult a text, especially in the middle of a lesson, to ensure that a response was acceptable? Shouldn't teachers have the necessary understanding of their content to confidently deliver lessons without relying upon an answer guide? I mean, if the teacher doesn't know, how well can that knowledge be shared with students, especially when addressing abstract concepts that do not possess a singular interpretation? The passion that I developed for teaching ELA stemmed from the requirement for me to delve deeply into the topics and the texts that I was working with. I spent hours reading and researching so that I could understand the various nuances and hidden messages within literature. I was able to differentiate between quality texts and identify texts that were not part of the canon, yet met my students' interests. This would not have been possible, nor would it have happened, if I was provided a textbook at the beginning of my teaching career. True, I may become adept to that content within, but how would I have learned to navigate when that content didn't match my students? Would I force them to work from the text that we had in class because that is what I knew? Or would I step outside of my comfort zone so that we could learn and grow together? Unfortunately, all too often, it is the former. The second lesson. This past weekend marked Memorial Day, a time of the year that means different things to different people. For some, it is the unofficial start to summer. For some, it marks the end of the school year. And for some, it is a time to remember those who sacrificed their lives in the armed forces in the name of this country. What bothered me was that this weekend also marked historical significance that is often disregarded. In fact, had it not been for the 100th anniversary, we really like those big events, huh? I doubt it would have garnered the attention that it did. I'm talking, of course, about the Tulsa Race Massacre. Like many others, my current students, didn't know much about this event. They didn't know that an entire community, 35 blocks, were destroyed out of racial hatred. They didn't know that the black residents, those who were not killed or who had fled, were arrested and held in holding centers while a mob of white people looted, damaged, and destroyed nearly everything. Homes, schools, churches, businesses, a hospital, and even a library. They didn't know that historians now estimate that those who died may possibly number as many as 300. They didn't know. And you know why? Because our textbooks don't talk about these things. Our textbooks justify, romanticize, or completely erase the dark history of this country. But it is history. It is our history. Not just Black history, but American history. To be honest, this isn't just limited to the tarnished past of African Americans. This is true for other minority groups as well. In fact, one of the most powerful lessons that I have ever taught, and it addressed the standard of examining texts from various perspectives, was the historical documentation of the treatment of minority groups in this country. It was then that my students learned about the forced assimilation of Native Americans as they were stripped of their lands, names, and languages. It was then that my students learned about the Japanese internment camps during World War II. It was then that my students learned about the deplorable labor camps of Chinese immigrants as they helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It was then that they learned about the vigilante Texas Rangers who terrorized Mexican Americans along the border. See, I'm going to pause for a moment here because that is one of the many things that bothers me about being ignorant to our own history. While often revered as being defenders of law and order, the Texas Rangers have a long history of racial violence. There are numerous accounts of them rounding up and executing indigenous Texans and Mexican Americans alike. There are accounts of them raiding towns and destroying property. And yet, we speak very little about that. In fact, we even have a baseball team named after them. I mean, could you imagine if we had a football team named the Alabama Klansmen? My point is, we cannot fault students or even entire populations for their ignorance when we perpetuate the same skewed narratives that were often taught to us. As educators, we pride ourselves on developing students who are capable of critical thinking, and we boast about amplifying student voices, and yet, through our curriculum, we often stifle their understanding of the world or reduce their voices to echo that which they have been taught. If you really want to be an equitable educator, delegate that textbook as just one of the many resources that you will use within your classroom. Now, this is supposed to be a pause to ponder episode, not a lecture. So I'm going to stop with these two lessons because I'm sure that I've made my point clear. However, if you need additional convincing or would simply like to discuss this concept in greater depth, I would be more than happy to connect. I think it's important for us to reflect on the underlying realities of situations. We consistently complain about the state of education, and we attempt to address those issues through superficial reform, which in reality is little more than repackaging the same old ideologies as new and innovative. What if we took the matter into our own hands and stopped pushing the narrative that the textbook companies are selling and started providing our students with a more holistic view of the world around them? What if we took the time to realize that we are expected to have our students meet standards and had the courage to push back against traditional resources or antiquated canons? These are not rhetorical, because the reality is that educators around the country are doing this very thing. And in some cases, such as the very heated debate around the implementation of critical race theory, are coming under intense scrutiny. But that, my listeners, is a conversation for another time. I want you to think about what I have shared with you today. Think about the impact that you could have on your students if you simply stepped outside of the curriculum and your comfort zone. Think about the power that they could bring into spaces if they were equipped with more knowledge than what is provided by some company. Think about why you've decided to be an educator and the role you want to play in the enrichment of your students. Think about it. Until next time. I want to thank you for listening to the Counter Narrative Podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please be sure to like, subscribe, and of course, share it with friends and family. I'd also love to hear your thoughts about the show, so please leave a comment or two as well. Now, I'm not sure what platform you're using, but the show can be found on Anchor, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and plenty of other platforms. If the show isn't on your preferred site, let me know, and I'll be sure to get it up and running. This podcast is also featured on schoolrubric.com, where you can find educational articles, videos, and interviews with educators from around the globe. Be sure to connect with me and other listeners by following the show on Twitter at the CN Podcast and joining the show's Facebook group. Take care.